Is it, so,
Whenever you want, we can go live.
what?
Whenever you want,
Uh-huh.
we can go live.
Okay. Do you think we should wait a few more minutes?
כמה זמן אנחנו נותנים לווליד?
תשמע, אנחנו לא צריכים להילחץ. אפשר גם עוד 10 דקות אחרי, לא יודעים
5 דקות.
יש לו רבע שעה. בסדר. Everybody please sit down so we can start. Let's wait for everybody to come. Okay. Stefano? Okay. Give me a thumbs up when you start. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming for our event at the Biodiversity Day, focusing on marine conservation and the climate crisis, challenges and adaptive solutions. We have a keynote speaker from the OECD and then 5 scientific talks about different ecosystems and how they deal with climate change and their challenges. This will be followed by a panel discussion with 3 people from different disciplines. Our chief scientist from the Ministry of the Environment. We have a marine ecologist from PML, from Plymouth Marine Laboratory. And we have a desert ecologist from Israel, Yaron Ziv. They will give their own perspective and comment on what we are talking about, and maybe discuss the issues that are relevant to policy making as well. So we'll start with an opening statement by Professor Noga Kornfeld-Shaw from the Ministry of the Environment, and then we'll have the keynote speaking and so on. So Noga, please.
Thank you, Gil, and good morning. So as you all know, biodiversity is the amazing diversity of plants, animals, and living organisms on our planet. And we're now facing the sixth extinction of biodiversity, which is different from all the previous extinctions in two ways. One is that it is man-made, and the second is that the rate is unprecedented. The biodiversity crisis is not standing alone. We know that we are facing the climate crisis, which we are all dealing with in this conference, also the pollution, environmental pollution crisis. And these 3 crises accelerate each other. So they can't be dealt with in silos. We have to deal with biodiversity when we deal with climate change. We know that the biodiversity crisis, biodiversity is not only influenced negatively by the biodiversity, by the global warming crisis, it also accelerates it, reducing the ability of nature to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on one hand, and moderate extreme environmental risks on the other. I'd like to tell you in a few words about a project that I'm leading now at the Ministry for Environmental Protection. We are trying to map the risks, the vulnerabilities, and the adaptive capacity of different functions to climate change. And we're talking about economic sensitivity, about social sensitivity, functional ability, but the most difficult thing to deal with is environmental sensitivity. We don't have a way to map sensitivity in a detailed way, in a way that will enable us to identify which are the most vulnerable areas that we need to put more effort and protect. And I think it's It's the role of the scientific community to help us gather and understand the vulnerability of nature and how we can help protect it and make it more resilient to climate change. If you're here tomorrow, we are going to present tomorrow at 10 our risk mapping tool that we developed together with Tomorrow.io. And unfortunately, even though this is my own interest, we still don't have any biodiversity maps included in this tool, and I think they should be. So this is something that I will be happy to have all of you contribute to, and we can try to develop such a tool together looking at biodiversity and not just at economics. And I hope that maybe next year in COP28 we will be able to include biodiversity in our climate risk mapping tool. So I'm looking forward to hear all the scientists, my friends that are going to talk here. And I would like to apologize in advance. I'm taking part in the negotiations, and once they call me when the article that I'm supposed to present is on, I'll have to leave, and it's supposed to be sometime during this event. So I apologize in advance that if I'll have to leave. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is the keynote speaker, Walid, from Professor Walid, your family name? Wesley. From the OECD, is the head of division on the environment and many other things, so please take the stage.
Thank you, Gil. Thank you. So the PowerPoint, please. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm really honored to be here, dear distinguished colleagues and all friends here in the room. So I will make a brief opening remarks for our session today, but maybe I can say a few words about the subject or the aim of my presentation. It will go mainly from international perspective on what are the main challenges and what would be the policy solution of it. The panel will deal with many scientific results, also scientific challenges, but we know at the end of the day what we need today is action, implementation for biodiversity, and there's emergency. I'll show that clearly in my presentation. So let's start immediately by the nature of the problem. So we know that all economic activities and human health and well-being depends on the nature services provided, food, fresh water, pollination, nutrient recycling. So that's something which human activity is driving the unprecedented rate of biodiversity loss, with over 1 million plant and animal species currently threatened with extinction. For instance, in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Israel, 88% to 95% of the mollusk species historically present have disappeared and non-endogenous species are thriving. That's one characteristic that we can see in the literature, and this is due mainly to human activity. Climate change is the fastest growing driver of biodiversity loss. In recent years, many regions have experienced the climate-induced shift in the species composition and distribution, changing migration and breeding patterns and proliferation of invasive species, both marine and terrestrial ecosystem. The IPCC report predicts that under 2-degree warming scenarios, 99% of the world's coral reefs will decline. 18% of insect species will lose at least half of their population, and 13% of land will shift to a new biome. At the same time, the destruction of our ecosystems itself is contributing to climate change and increasing society vulnerability to floods, droughts, extreme precipitation, wildfires, heat waves, and other climate impacts. This only shows us that climate and biodiversity crises are highly interconnected, two faces of the same coin, and that need to be addressed very quickly. What are the directions for that? So, the key directions to protect the global ecosystems while mitigating and adapting to climate change, it's fundamental to build the existing international efforts, while at the same time implementing effective solutions on the ground. First, we must rapidly scale up action to mitigate and adapt climate change. Allowing temperature to rise to 2 degrees above will be catastrophic for many species and will place further strain on ecosystem services with severe impact on the society. So it means if we do nothing, actually we will have cascading effects. So this will affect biodiversity, but in return, the loss of biodiversity will increase climate change. So we are running after a phenomenon that we have to figure out how we stop it. Second, when they meet next month in COP15 in Montreal of the Convention on Biological Diversity, governments must adopt an ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Ambitious and smart targets are needed to address unsustainable land use, over-exploitation of natural resources, and the other drivers of biodiversity loss. Reducing these drivers can help increase ecosystem resilience. So, third, we must harness synergy between biodiversity and climate action by scaling up nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions are measures that protect, sustainable, manage, and restore nature. They play a key role to maintain and enhance ecosystem services, while at the same time building resilience to climate change, storing CO2, and addressing a number of other societal challenges. For example, protecting rural wildland also helps mitigate climate change and reduce water stress, while protecting coastal, wetland, and coral reefs. There's a growing evidence of the potential of nature-based solutions to adapt to growing climate risks, both in complement to and instead of gray infrastructure. Nature-based solutions tend to perform well over a wide range of geographic and climate conditions and provide many socio-economic and environmental benefits, many examples of which will found our work in the OECD. For instance, in recent years, we show that nature-based solutions have gained with international support. They are reflected in the Paris Agreement and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Nature-based solutions have also been made the priority under the latest G20 and COP26 in Glasgow. Growing domestic support, policy support, a number of countries also refer to NBS in their NDC as a way to achieve their climate mitigation. Doing a scan of 35 OECD countries with national adaptation plan, and strategy, we found that 24 explicitly encourage the use of NBS. Among water-related risks, urban flooding referred to most frequently. However, despite their growing use in many countries, much potential remains untapped. In light of current environmental and climate change, there is a scope to scale up their use and enhance their benefit. NBS are subject to some challenges. First, low awareness and of the use of benefits of the NBS. Here, the reason mainly for the benefits because they are non-market value benefits. And that's often what happens when any environmental policy can get results that the market cannot capitalize, or at least cannot capitalize implicitly. But we know through research on economics that we can reveal those values. I can give you a concrete example here in investment in NBS in urban setting. We know one mitigation policy is ongoing is to reduce the number of cars, conventional cars on the road, and this will create more space. So we have to think about all the parking spaces that will be left for good reason. If municipality decide to plant trees, for instance, this kind of way to fight against the island heatland, to decrease temperature, that would be an interesting environmental impact. But this also can have an important economic impact. We have been working in US cities on how much open space the cities provide. Is it enough? Is it not? And this was economic study showing that the provision of open spaces, parks, trees, etc., would provide an implicit important value for the housing market. And this can go from 20 to 40% in the value of lands and houses. So it's a huge amount of economic benefit. But just here the policymaker, when putting in balance the cost of action and the benefit of action, he has to think about non-market values. And economic research developed some methods, including what we call the hedonic price, that we're looking, for instance, in established market, what would be the impact of external effect like NBS in evaluation, may change completely the way how we proceed. So that's just insights for you in the future. So here, I'll go faster because I think I'm running out of time, and I want to tell you some key findings from our work in the OECD about NBS and adaptation plan and strategy. So we have some important policy issues related to the implementation of NBS. First, at the governance level. So I think I skip it, yeah. So we have multipliers, and coordination, vertical coordination is really needed. It's important that the government give the guidance, the vision for the country, and make actually the transition happen. But who will act, who will implement should be the local and the local stakeholders, not only local authorities, but also businesses and citizens. That's what the IPCC report called the transformative change. It's a change in the mindset that the problem of climate, even it looks to be global, it's mainly a local action. And this have to be translated in any decision taken by any authorities, from the national to the regional to the local level, including citizens. And also this comes through the needs to share information. Policies. NBS are integrated, start as we show in our survey that has started to be important, but the design and the trade-offs, as we talked about, still in earlier stage. the regulatory requirement also, and here I would draw your attention on one important policies. It's the land use and planning policy that any country is conducting. This is really important because it's fix the setting in which our activity will be developed. Say that you are ambitious to develop. Thank you. I still have 2 minutes. Think that you have an important policy to make like electrification of your mobility. But in the same time, your urban setting is car dependent, that people don't have any alternative. I know because I worked on transport system in Israel, I know this one of the problems. So one key policy instrument is the land use policies. You have to change the setting to make your cities friendly to alternative mobility. Soft mobility, shared mobility, public transport, that's one of these aspects. Yes, and technology capacity, which really an important that have to be stringent. Finance, that's mobilizing finance, still one of the key important element. And let me now just conclude in 1 minute, I think, if I may. I want just to say a few words about this very linked problem, biodiversity and climate change. Our generation, you and I, we are the first generation in the history of the humanity that facing a double challenge. We have to first to continue our effort to mitigate. We are far away from it. We need a lot of effort to do that. And when I look to the number of countries who updated their NDCs, there are only 33 countries today out of 196 who signed the Paris Agreement. So effort and challenge is still there. And then this have to go deeply in transformative change, as I mentioned shortly. But another important challenge upcoming is to adapt our societies and our economies to the climate change impacts, which will be very important. The last IPCC report, the 6th report, show us something new that I would like absolutely to draw your attention to it, that the climate change impact is not anymore incremental. In our mind, it's the temperature will increase progressively, not so linear that we think. It's with the tipping points, this extreme, unexpected, strong, violent events that can happen in different areas in the world will make our effort on adaptation more than needed. The investment, preparation of our society is very important. But be careful, both challenges will go together. It's not a question of trade-off. We have to continue our effort in mitigating our emission, but in the same time to adapt our thing. So if I may have 10 seconds, sorry, I will abuse my, so that's effort will need huge amount of investment in a resilient infrastructure to protect people and cannot go otherwise. Change in the mindset is important, but individuals we would do the best that we can, but governments have the first responsibility to do it by designing good policies. Good policy means effective policies, to be clear. It's not to do a policy and not to be implemented or applied. Have to go to be efficient, effective, and changing life of people. Still, I would say I'm a little bit catastrophic when I'm saying these words, but this may be the truth that everyone have to say around you, back to your home country. You have to think about it carefully. It's important, but keep optimistic because we are here. This means that we want to discuss and we want to sort it out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Walid, for this interesting presentation. We're continuing now with the idea of introducing different type of ecosystems. My name is Marcelo Stember. I'm from Tel Aviv University. And our next speaker is Dr. Will Grilov from the Israel Immunological Oceanographic Institute and also from Haifa University. And we're going to have a link on marine ecosystems, how biodiversity in these type of ecosystems related to climate change. Please.
Thanks very much. Yes, I forgot to introduce myself. So I'm Gil from Haifa. So yes, one of the most pronounced expressions of climate change is changes in species distributions. Here's one example called tropicalization, where warming causes temperate species moving into more, tropical species moving more into temperate areas. And with this movement, they can also change species interactions and ecosystem functions. This is one example of how tropical grazing fish decimate algal forests by moving from tropical areas into different regions around the world where they decimate kelp forests and other things. We have also a local example in the Mediterranean. In this case, it's not just a species expansion. This is we humans dug a channel between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, and with that, hundreds of species moved in, including 2 rabbitfish that decimate macroalgae over there, and I'll talk more about this soon. The other aspect of climate change, as Walid just mentioned, is those catastrophic extreme events. I'm sure you all have heard, and some of you experienced. I did. I was walking in Rome at 40 degrees in June, and that was a huge heat wave that stayed there for more than 2 months. So as you know, most Europeans don't actually have air conditions, so they use creative ways to cool themselves. But a bit more seriously, this event caused excess mortality in some countries of over 15%, which is translated into more than 50,000 fatalities just because of this heat wave. And these heat waves does not affect only the terrestrial environment or in humans. It also was expressed in the marine environment. Here you can see the temperature above normal in the Mediterranean, and this summer it was mostly in the Western Mediterranean. You can also see some parts that are a bit cooler and haven't been warming this year. And this is a paper that came out in a perfect timing. During this marine heat wave, it was a list of 60 authors, including myself, where we describe the increase in marine heat waves and how they cause mass mortality events that are increasing in time. They include many different species, sponges, corals, urchins, and so on. And this is driven by the increase in the intensity and expanse of marine heat waves. Now we are zooming into this region. So in the Mediterranean itself, we are sitting now at the warmest part of the Mediterranean, the Middle East. You can see it by the colors here, which means that this is the trailing edge of most species. This is the warmest part, and a little bit of an increase in temperature can make them disappear. It's also warming the fastest in the Mediterranean. Actually, it's much faster than the global average, and above the predictions for the next century of the global average. And on top of that, we have this influx of invasive species, hundreds of them moving in. And we have evidence from that accumulated over the last decade of multiple species, native species collapses, and also a domination of alien species in many ecosystems. This is from fishing data. This is from shallow reefs that I've been studying. Total domination. Here's some examples. So we've lost many native species. We documented mostly of invertebrates, and mostly some of them very ecologically important. These are 3 examples. One of the biggest differences is that we don't have historical data. So for these 3 species that are ecologically important, we do have some points from the past. So we have lost an ecosystem engineer that builds unique reefs in the Mediterranean, this vermetid. We lost an important predator in the intertidal, which I studied during my PhD, was still there. Now it's gone almost. And sea urchins, very important herbivores, almost gone as well. And on the other hand, we are gaining a lot of newcomers. In fact, the rate of invasion is about between 60 and 100 species per 5 years over the last 30 years of many different kinds. This is from the MEDEC report that came out. This is the Mediterranean IPCC, which I also was leading a section on invasive species. And when in our reefs, when we count snails, as Walid just mentioned, almost every snail and the bivalve that we count is alien. And the macrophyte community is also dominated in some parts by alien species, and the fish communities are also almost half of them. What you count underwater is alien. So I hope that point one has been clear. We are experiencing a major regime shift into a novel ecosystem from a temperate Atlantic into a tropical Indo-Pacific through extinctions of native species and invasions of alien species. And this is driven strongly by climate change. And we are really moving into some alien world, and we need to understand how does that affect ecosystem functions, services like blue carbon, which I'll come back to in a second. So this huge change in biodiversity and potential ecosystem functions really presents a challenge for marine conservation. And in these couple of papers, we try to address it with a bunch of other researchers. We talked about adaptive marine conservation and what it needs. It needs a strong science for that. And we also talked about the need for flexible thinking and where and how to preserve, with a focus on climate refugia where you can, and preserving ecosystem functions and services in climate hotspots. If you cannot preserve local species, at least preserve the functions. So really the question that we need to ask ourselves is it realistic to expect to preserve native communities in climate change and bioinvasion hotspots, and what realistic descriptors can be used for conservation success in such areas. So let's zoom in on our region and the Israeli coast. I'll give you a first example from the blue carbon or service perspective and macrofauna. Macroalgal forests are important for many reasons. They are ecosystem engineered, they provide habitat for many species, they are food for many species, and they also contribute to potential carbon production. So 10-second explanation, what is blue carbon? This is basically a nature-based solution for reducing CO2 levels in the atmosphere. So just like trees on land absorb CO2 and can reduce emissions, macrophyte communities in the water can do the same thing, and this is becoming now quite evident. And what are the threats? Two major threats in our region for these macrophytes. So we mentioned already overgrazing by these invasive rabbitfish, and we've shown in experiments in Israel, followed the experiments in Turkey, that they can decimate whole forests very quickly. And overheating is another one. These are recent projections from Future Mares, a project that I'm involved in for this area. And we're talking about 4.5 degrees increase by the end of the century under the worst case scenario. So if in the 70s, temperatures in August were 29 degrees in the summer, and now it's almost 32, but it might be 36 by the end of the century, which is huge, and a huge threat. So that already killed the urchins. We know that from experiments. And also with the competition with rabbitfish, but it can be also a real challenge for these macrophyte communities that are very important. So this is probably how the reefs look like. We don't have photos from the 70 years ago, lush macrophyte, brown macroalgae, but most of the reef looks like this, turf barrens. And this is caused mostly by this rabbitfish grazing. You can see a grazing line here. This is how far they are willing to escape the shelter. But more and more of these turf areas are dominated by alien algae like this, in the Pacific one. And then this is a newcomer from the Atlantic, and they are taking space. And the question what we pose is, can these tropical aliens functionally compensate for the loss of native algae due to this overgrazing and overheating? And we're focusing here on carbon uptake. So we compared one important endemic species that I showed you before, Gongolaria, to two expanding aliens, Galaxaua and Lobophora. We compared the thermal sensitivity, seasonality, and annual carbon uptake. And obviously, I'm showing here a summary of 5 years of research in like one slide. But what we found is that the native species is has much lower optimum, so it's much more sensitive to warming. The native species is abundant only in the spring, while the alien species are found year-round. And when we measure and calculate the the annual carbon budget uptake of the invaders, we found that it surpasses the annual carbon uptake of the natives, which means that the native species, the alien species, can offset or restore the loss of blue carbon due to the loss of the native seaweed. So that's a good thing. We also found this, I don't have time to look at it, but if you look at fishery data, we see more and more invaders. We use these kind of indexes called the Community Thermal Index, and we see that this index is moving towards more thermophilic species, and they are mostly aliens. And part of them are problematic, others are actually commercials, which means we are experiencing this tropicalizations, means that some of these alien invaders probably compensate for the loss of ecologically and economically thermally sensitive native species due to warming. So the second take-home message is that what happens in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the southeastern Mediterranean, on the Israeli coast, will expand very quickly to the west and north. So we're going to see native species disappearing and alien species expanding, which I think now we can use our area as a canary in the coal mine for what will happen next. And finally, the third commercial 3 is that we need a more realistic view of alien species at the age of climate change, maybe even a paradigm shift. We must study and understand the traits, functions, and services of significant alien species to compare to the natives in the context of climate change. This information will allow us to make educated decisions on how to deal with them as threats or potentially as rescuers in the fast-warming ocean, and then to develop more realistic descriptors of what is a success when you do conservation. And this is a bit provocative. Can we consider some alien species and nature-based solutions? Thank you very much. And we'll move on to the next speaker, which is Professor Marcelo Sternberg from Tel Aviv University. We're going to switch from the ocean into the land, but dealing with similar issues.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much, Gil, and thank you all for coming. This is a busy day, and thank you for your attention for today. I'm going to introduce, we're talking about climate change, and actually we're talking about the issues of extreme events. I'm going to introduce a project that we're doing in the Mediterranean travelers in Israel. And in Israel, we are characterized as drylands. These natural areas are characterized by water deficiency, elements that relate to lack of water, and we have a characterization of very high variability on rainfall within years and within the rainfall season. And we're looking on climate change in our region. We expect an increase of uncertainty related to the reduction in water and rainfall. We expect an increase in temperature, but a key element is the increase in the frequency of extreme events, and that will actually lead to increase in the soil water deficiency in the natural ecosystems. This is actually at the end of the story, that our soils are getting drier and drier, and they are triggering changes in the whole ecosystem functioning. And talking about extremes and the thresholds, actually we are looking where are these thresholds, how much we can push the system until they collapse. And that's the basic idea of the project I'm going to introduce you today. Where is the threshold? Where is moving beyond the long-term capability of adaptability or resistance of the system? Some years ago, we studied a long-term experiment where we introduced the system to a drought, 30% drought, and we didn't see any change, actually. The plants and the system did not read our proposal, and as we expected to have some change, but nothing changed. And then we decided to move, to look beyond the 30%, which actually was the natural variability of the system, so going to extreme and trying to increase that uncertainty and that changes by moving up to really extreme drought. And we set up a new experimental in the field where we are testing extreme drought events, and also changing a very important component on rainfall, not only the amount, but the rainfall frequency, how this frequency of the changes within the rainfall season is changing as well. That's another important component of our ecosystems. So we set up an experiment design where actually we're looking on the natural conditions, what are the controls, and we have another treatment. We're changing the rainfall distribution by having only 9 rainfall events of 20 millimeters rainfall. That's a regular distribution of the rainfall, and testing on the same amount of rainfall, the same amount of drought, actually it's only giving 33% of the natural rainfall they receive by irrigation, by changes in the only 3 events of 60 millimeters rainfall, and changes how this will affect the natural ecosystems. We set up a new experimental setup, rainout shelters, that actually are completely drought in the system, and we manage the rainfall that is applying to each side of the area. So actually we are becoming type of God. We decide how much rainfall and when this rainfall is coming. So we're testing how the system is responding to these changes, and each color here represents a year that is also related to the natural rainfall they have in each particular year. And we see, if we're looking on the biomass production, mainly the herbaceous component of our system, we see an important reduction of biomass production every year. And we look on the continuing of these years, we see that in the extreme drought event with low frequency events, actually we particularly seen a significant change, a more significant decrease in the total amount of biomass. It took some time, but we're seeing already a major change on the amount of biomass that is being produced in the system. And we look on other important component of the biodiversity, the number of species that we have in the system, and the species diversity. So not only how is the relative composition, the relative abundance of these species, we also see a major change in the species diversity. So we're seeing that the system that we didn't see any change in the past within the 30%. When we move the system towards extreme drought, we're really seeing a major change, and is occurring. But this change, it took some time to become evident. So we can conclude that definitely we see that extreme drought has a significant effect on the biomass production and the species diversity, different from the previous years, as I mentioned before. We see that this rainfall in distribution have a significant, that became evident only after time. We have a system that's been evolved to be resistant to drought, but it needs more time to get the evidence, to get the key if the system is functioning or not, responding. So land use management also should have consideration how we manage the land. Mainly these lands are used for rangelands. How we take into that in consideration the negative and the positive feedbacks, and mainly for range management and land use, forage production in these type of ecosystems. We see that ecosystem services definitely will be affected by this extreme drought, and we definitely need some preparedness to get ready because this is coming. And the importance of what you're doing is actually trying to get the empirical research that is needed to bring the future now, not to have only the long-term monitoring, because we need a response, and by doing experimental work, doing manipulations, experiments, definitely we can change the system and see which is the main driver that is bringing us the system today. So definitely it's important to look also definitely on the long-term as well, long-term data, something that is still missing in the climate change research, and is critical for providing the policymakers where we're going. So we definitely need the national support and the finance of for these research infrastructures. We have very few research infrastructures in Israel, and this is a critical element that many countries already understood, that financing research infrastructure for long-term research is critical, and provide also the tools for the policymakers to do the decisions that should be based on science-based. Yes. So, and definitely we know that uncertainty will continue. That's something that relates to all issues on climate change. So we also must take decisions, or what we call it no-regret actions. No-regret meaning that we know a little, we have some ideas, and definitely take this action, not to wait to have, as a scientist, having the total knowledge. Definitely we have some hints and try to go with our hints. And the nature-based solutions also definitely can be a very important tool to get these hints and go forward to the stability of the system. So, sorry for that. So, thank you for attention and stand by time. So, thank you very much. So, we are moving to not to freshwater ecosystems now. Moving from terrestrial ecosystems, the freshwater ecosystems will be definitely affected and the most sensitive in the issues of climate change in drylands. So please, we're introducing Yaron Herzkovich from Tel Aviv University, who's given us this perspective on what's going on freshwater. Please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Yes, as Marcelo said, we're moving from terrestrial into freshwater, and specifically streams and rivers. And as you will see, these are interlinked and these are interweaved because freshwater ecosystems, or like streams, rivers, lakes, they are located embedded in the terrestrial system, which means that everything that happens in the terrestrial area in the ecosystem of the terrestrial zone will affect these ecosystems as well. But let's start with the drivers. We heard about the changes in the Middle East, and the predictions are that the Middle East is warming twice as fast as other regions, and these are some of the recent predictions from, this is a last paper from 2022, this year, that climate change or climate prediction indicates future warming. You can see here by mid-21st century and by the end of the century, it will be extremely hot. But also we will see changes in precipitation, and especially in the Mediterranean, which means that eventually we will, this will lead to in some part, or in the northern part, in the Mediterranean, to severe droughts, but also it is predicted that the southern part will get more rain. That eventually will lead, or might lead, to severe droughts and extreme droughts. So two extremes, and the extremities will increase. How will these affect Mediterranean streams? So now we are talking about, if these were the drivers, now we have to see what are the pressures, what will happen in the system. We need to learn that in order to prepare. So we need to understand what are the Mediterranean climate stream, what are the essentials, what are the distinctive hydrograph, and this is the driver of the system, the natural discharge. You can see here the hydrograph, the mean annual discharge in autumn, winter, spring, and summer. And this is a distinctive hydrograph of the Mediterranean stream or Mediterranean ecosystem, river ecosystems. Winter floods followed by continuous and gradual summer drying. And the system is adapted to that. The animals, the entire ecosystem is adapted to this, these events. However, this doesn't work so much. I cannot see what's going on here. Yeah, it dried. Okay. However, the changes in climate are predicted to lead to these extreme events in which winter floods will become more extreme. We'll get heavier rains, and that means that also harsher floods. On the other hand, the entire season will squid. So we'll get prolonged droughts and an earlier onset. This means that the entire ecosystem will change accordingly. And then we have to ask ourselves, what will be the consequences of this change? What are the ecological effects? So we'll start with floods. What will be the ecological effects of floods? Yeah. First, let's look at the direct effects of flood. Flood means higher energy and faster flows, which means also scouring of habitats. such as water plants, stones, cobbles, and sand, on which animals live. We also see changes, rapid changes in water quality, which means that as you can see here, or maybe you cannot really see, elevated turbidity, depleted oxygen, and also resuspension of materials that are embedded in the sediment, and toxic materials that will be resuspended and affect the animals. This eventually could lead to this will affect sensitive and unadapted species that are not adapted to these extreme floods, and water quality will change fast, which means that animals like mollusks, crustaceans, and fish might be affected dramatically. But there will also be indirect effects, which means our response as humanity, as society, for example, in order to mitigate floods, we usually, or in many cases, drainage authorities implement these flood mitigation measures using bulldozers to expand the channel. And this, of course, will lead to, or is already leading, to habitat loss and geomorphological alteration. This is not a natural system, it's a channel. Increased rainfall will also lead to increased agricultural runoff, soil erosion, and that's, as I said, is connected to the terrestrial environment, and especially in the agricultural land. This input of soil runoff will bring agri-pollutants like nutrients, pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides into the streams, and of course will affect the ecosystem itself. And in urban systems, we usually, you can see here maybe at the bottom, this is a drainage system. There will be overflow. We see that almost every year now, that the urban drainage are overflowing into the streams and bring this toxic cocktail of oils, heavy metals, plastic, sewage, and so on from the city. Yeah. And on the other hand, droughts. You can see here an extreme drought, deterioration of water quality, loss of connectivity, loss of microhabitats, and early drying, which of course will lead to ecological responses as we see it resist, migrate, or perish. Sensitive species that need the flow and high levels of oxygen will perish. Adapted and tolerant species will become more predominant. And this eventually will lead to changes in the community structure and ecosystem functioning. Unfortunately, as we know, we are not, we are already in an ecosystem which is already deteriorated. Water pollution, water abstraction, damming are already affecting the system, of course, intensive agriculture. And recent paper from the Living Planet Index showed that freshwater ecosystems around the world have already lost 83% of the species, which is far steeper drop than terrestrial or marine. So what can we do to protect biodiversity in Mediterranean and beyond? First, we need to identify. We need data. We need to identify and then to protect biodiversity hotspots, for example, the key biodiversity areas. We have to reduce existing pressures because they are already masking climate change. Climate change is affecting existing pressures. We have to remove these. We have to remove barriers to allow species to migrate upstream to refugia sites, and to adapt a more holistic river basin management planning in order to consider all stakeholders. It's not just the stream, it's the stream and the entire catchment basin that affects the stream and the lake and the sea at the end. And the last point, as mentioned at the keynote, apply nature-based solution where possible in order to mitigate some of these effects, but also to gain some ecosystem services. And for example, this is my last slide. This is an example of a new restoration project, the Tzipori project, led by the Kishon Drainage and River Authority in Israel. And you can see here, this is an illustration, but hopefully it will be completed next year, transforming an abandoned fish pond, which was a pollutant, into a floodplain. by using this floodplain, we can reduce floods, we can recharge groundwater, and of course, we can create a new wetland with biodiversity support and also a community that can develop around it, plants and animals and so on. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Yaron, for your very interesting presentation. We try to combine all the ecosystems that are interacting together, marine, freshwater ecosystems, terrestrial ecosystems. Now we have a very important ecosystem to introduce, urban ecosystems. And I am pleased to introduce Professor Dan Malkinson from Haifa University, who is going to give us a hint about one of the largest, becoming the largest in Israel, urban ecosystems.
Good morning, everybody. I will be talking about biodiversities and particularly about urban areas and what is happening in these landscapes and what perhaps can be done. So what is forward? This is okay. There are several characteristics which characterize urban environments, and the first one is that they are dominated by non-permeable surfaces, which means that, as has been discussed previously, when the rain falls on the landscape, the rain cannot penetrate or infiltrate into the ground, and as it hits non-permeable surfaces, and it runoffs into the cities and into the streets and generates floods in the cities. So this is one of the characteristics of urban areas. Another characteristic of urban areas is the high heterogeneity of the landscape. So we have small lots and plots, and we have small gardens as opposed to natural areas which have extended areas of natural or agricultural landscapes. The cities are characterized by very small plots. But if we take a closer look at the city, we still have ecosystems functioning in the city. So in spite of the fact that we have non-permeable surfaces, we have trees, we have functioning ecosystems. What is a functioning ecosystem? It begins with primary production. So we have trees which produce biomass, and every place that we look in the city, we can see the existence of the ecosystems in the city. So for example, when I walk into my house, I look at the corner of the house, I see the cobwebs, and I see the spiders in my house. I know that it's a functioning ecosystem because there is predation. It means that there is prey in my house. Everything is functioning. So this is one characteristic. These are two characteristics, so it's a difficult word, of urban ecosystems. Another thing, another property of urban systems or urban landscapes is the urban heat island effect. So essentially, in areas where there are large and dense human populations, what has been recorded in many places is elevated temperatures in the within the city. So commonly within the city, the temperatures are higher by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, and as you move outwards toward the outskirts of the city and towards the rural areas, then the background temperature is 2 to 3 degrees lower. I'm sorry. What else characterizes the urban environment? So urban areas, they cover about 3% of the Earth's landscape. But surprisingly, there are some urban areas which harbor very high species diversity and are considered to be hotspots, so biodiversity hotspots. In addition to that, 5% of the vascular plants are found in cities, which cover only 3% of the land. So they overrepresent proportionally the number of vascular vascular plant species which are found in the world. Additionally, 20% of the birds species can be observed in cities. From the research which has been conducted worldwide by in many studies, the main factor dictating species diversity in urban areas is the proportion of non-permeable surfaces to permeable surfaces. So the larger the proportion of sealed surface, then the lower biodiversity occurs in the city. So once we increase, if we have the opportunity to do that, to increase non-sealed surfaces, then this will increase our biodiversity. Another thing to note is that cities or urban areas behave as biofilters to biodiversity. That means that some species, particularly mammals and some insects, will not enter the urban area for various reasons. For example, in Israel, we don't have lions and zebras inside cities because we don't have lions and zebras in Israel. But we do have gazelles in Israel, and we won't find gazelles inside cities. In contrast, we would find wild boars in cities, and foxes, and jackals. So for various reasons, cities act as biofilters and eliminate some of the natural species from entering these landscapes. Because of the phenomena of urban heat islands, the effects of climate change are going to be extenuated in urban areas. And due to the forecasted changes in precipitation patterns, it's not only the precipitation amounts which are going to change, but also the precipitation regimes, which also will induce it is assumed that they will induce increased flooding inside cities. So these are the two phenomena which are expected to occur, some of the phenomena which are expected to occur inside cities. So what can be done in urban areas? And Amir, this is for you. Okay. So one of the things that we can do is we can alleviate some of the problems by constructing habitat analogs. Habitat analogs have been found to harness large biodiversity of both plants and insects and birds in species. And this is achieved by constructing green roofs and green walls in buildings. The competition for land inside urban areas is very intense. Some people would like to see solar panels on rooftops. Other people would like to see green roofs. Other people would like to see roofs as social areas for people to socialize in due to the immense competition and lack of space inside urban areas. So this is one of the fundamental problems in urban areas. What will these areas will be used for and can be used for? So as I've said, green roofs can provide habitat analogs for natural areas. And one of the challenges, is particularly in Mediterranean areas where we have long and dry summers, is how to maintain the vegetation on top of on the rooftops. So one alternative, due to the scarcity of water in the region, is to use air conditioning generated water to irrigate the rooftops. But this brings us into a conflict, because the ecologists would like to see natural vegetation on top of the roofs. And this is what we call brown roofs. They're not irrigated during the summer, but they harness the native vegetation. If we irrigate the rooftops during the summer, then we won't have our natural native vegetation. So this is one of the dilemmas we're facing in urban areas. For example, in this experiment, we installed green rooftops above offices. This is the building of Haifa municipality, and beneath each of these plots, we have an office. And during the summer, of course, all of the people, all of the workers, they turn on the air conditioning. Wow, I have only 2 minutes. I thought that people turn on the air conditioning, and it's difficult to measure the effect of the green roofs on the temperatures inside offices. So we came in Israel's first working day is Sunday, so Sunday morning we measured the temperature in the offices because over the weekend the air conditioning wasn't working, and we saw that the green plots decreased the temperature in the offices by 2 degrees, meaning that we have a mechanism to reduce energy costs. So these are green roofs. An additional property of green roofs is that they mitigate stormwater floods in the city because the surfaces act as a sponge. They collect the water and slowly release it, meaning that this reduces the risks of flooding in the city. So what are some of my concluding thoughts? And this is all personal, doesn't relate to the government of Israel, I admit. In arid and semi-arid regions, brown roofs can help maintain the biodiversity. But this comes at the risk of, if we will have continuous climate change, they will become refugia because the surrounding landscape will dry and we will have just small islands of native biodiversity on the rooftops. Is it good? Is it bad? I don't know. In contrast, those brown roofs cannot provide the energetic benefits to the buildings. So again, we have this dilemma. Do we want to have the green roofs, which are habitat analogs for native species, or do we want to have these structures to benefit the people, the well-being of the people sitting in the offices and reduce the temperature and reduce energy consumption? Another thing to consider is that given that the temperature in the cities is already 2 to 3 degrees higher than what we have in the surrounding landscape, this is also already a litmus test for what would be occurring in the surrounding environment. So this is also something that we can take a look at in order to understand what is happening in the surrounding, what is expected to happen in the surrounding landscape. So there are 3 P's for planning for the future, and that is plan, prepare, and photosynthesize. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan, for the interesting presentation on urban ecosystems. And now we're moving to agricultural ecosystems, that also the interface between the natural and the urban and the artificial land use. So I'm pleased to introduce Professor Yael Mandelik from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Please, Yael.
Hello, good morning. So when we deal with the effects and challenges of climate change in agroecosystems, it is important to note that we are dealing with 3 facets phenomena. The first is the effect of climate change on the plant crops themselves. The second is the effect on the organisms providing ecosystem services, which are mostly insects in the agricultural arena. And the third one is the interaction between those plants and the organisms, mostly insects. So we are dealing with a very complex and multi-directional system, which is hard, complex to understand and to manage. But nevertheless, we do have some build-up of both concepts and understanding and data on how to address this. And I want to present this very broad topic, focusing on a model system of pollinators and crop pollination, and from the data we have on that model system to build up and to highlight the more general aspect of climate change in agroecosystems. So just very briefly on why we should care about pollinators and pollination. Biotic pollination is crucial for both natural ecosystems. Most of the flowering plants in the world require pollinators in order to reproduce. And it is also crucial for for the human diet. More than 30%, more than 1/3 of the human global diet relies on crops that need these pollinators in order to set fruits and seeds. So if we want to visualize the effect, the importance of pollinators to our nutrition, this is how our supermarkets and groceries look like nowadays when we do have the pollinators, mainly the bees. But if we are going to lose all these pollinators, this is what our groceries are going to look like, eliminating all the fruits, the vegetables, the nuts that are related to pollinators. And this is how our breakfast plate is going to look like without pollinators. So obviously we are not going to starve, but we are going to have a very low diverse diet and with low nutritional values. Specifically in our region, in Israel and in the Eastern Mediterranean basin, it is considered a global hotspot of pollinators, bees in specific. In Israel, we have more than 1,100 known bee species. So the outcomes of the research, the data, the information that we gather on research done in this region is very relevant to at the global scale in general. And the very high diversity of pollinators in Israel translates into a very high potential for the delivery of pollination services. However, a main limiting factor is the gaps in our knowledge concerning the diversity and the activity patterns of main pollinators. And therefore, in this work, where we wanted to assess the potential of the delivery of pollination services across the ecosystem of Israel, we had to base our assessment on expert opinion using the availability of floral and nesting resources and extent of pesticide use. And as you can see in the map, we were able to assess the variability in the potential delivery of different ecosystems to pollination services. When we address the potential risk of climate change on biodiversity, ecosystem services, and pollinators in specific, it is important to put it into the right perspective. And the right perspective is that insects are in severe decline over the last few decades. It's not something new, it is just an ongoing phenomenon. And this article from the New York Times, published that just a few years ago, compiled both scientific papers, but mostly evidence from non-scientists witnessing a very sharp decrease in the encounter of insects while they hike, while they drive their cars, while they bike. And the compilation of this data, together with some very strong scientific data, made them term this era as the insect apocalypse era, or the insect apocalypse is here. And they also termed it as the windshield phenomena because it's a gradual, ongoing phenomena. And this is why it is hard to acknowledge and to witness it. And the main limiting factor is, as the previous speaker emphasized, the main limiting factor is the availability of good long-term monitoring data. And two examples of organism for which we do have this data is the one bumblebee. And you can see here. You can see the original area of distribution, and the dark one is what is left. And at the bottom, you can see the similar pattern for the monarch butterflies, a huge decrease in their abundance and in their distribution. So indeed, we are witnessing a very dramatic overall decrease in the abundance of insects and pollinators in specific. This work of Jeff Ollerton and colleagues summarizes the accumulative number of extinctions of pollinators in Britain for a very long period, because they do have good monitoring data. And we can see that extinctions are an ongoing phenomena, but it is especially increasing in the 1920s and on, and it is especially related to land use changes, mainly agricultural and intensification. One of the first works that mapped the decline in diversity of pollinators, a work by Kos Bismael, showed the decline in pollinators before and after the 1980s in Britain and the Netherlands. All the red dots indicate declines in diversity, and the blue ones increase. And you can see that for the majority of samples, the bees decreased after the 1980s, and for the Hoover flies, it's more diverse results. The important thing is that, as I mentioned before, the climate change is one more factor that is affecting insects in general and pollinators in specific. And you can see here all the different factors that affect them, mainly land use effects and agricultural intensification. But all those red signs indicate the factors that are related directly or indirectly to climate change. And you can see that climate change have a very diverse set of factors of risk for insects. I will skip this, and I want to go to two examples showing how we can potentially mitigate those negative effects. So one avenue to go to is to maintain diverse communities of pollinators. And the reason for that is what I want to show you here. So this is a meta-analysis, a global study. Israel was part of that. And what we measured here, on the x-axis, you have a measure of diversity. So as you move on the x-axis, you have more and more diverse pollinator communities. And on the y-axis, you can see a measure showing the interannual variation in the abundance and diversity of our bee communities. So what you can see here is that the more diverse community of pollinators, the lower interannual variation in their abundance and diversity. And this is, of course, something positive from the pollination services delivery perspective. Farmers do want to have as steady as possible communities in their farms. So keeping diverse communities of pollinators is a very good strategy. The second strategy is actually implementing different land use management that promote the availability of the limiting resources for pollinators, which are mainly nesting and floral resources. And this, again, is a meta-analysis, a global scale in which Israel was part. And this is for the different parts of Europe, and the most relevant for us is the lower panel, the southern part of Europe. And on the x-axis, you can see different types of mitigation measures. all have to do with how we manage mainly the agricultural land in order to increase the availability of floral nesting resources. And you can see the increase in the abundance of pollinators when we manage the land in a way that supports higher availability of floral nesting resources. So I want to summarize. Climate change is one among a series of stressors that affect the pollinators, insects in general, and pollinators in specific. And it is important to note that there are various synergistic negative effects that are acting, and therefore it is more complicated and hard to predict the final outcome. They are acting on different spatial scales, local to the landscape, and again, this is challenging to manage. And they are multifaceted, direct, indirect, and they are plant-mediated, and again, this increases the complexity of the problem that we need to deal with. The mitigation should address two components: maintaining the diversity of pollinator communities and making higher availability of floral nesting resources, and probably most importantly, working on the capacity building, increasing our basic knowledge concerning the biology, ecology of those pollinators in order to be able to properly address all these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen, for a very interesting talk. We have finished with our scientific Yes, this is recorded, so we need those microphones, I guess. So thanks for fascinating 5 scientific talks and a more general keynote about the necessity of what we are doing. We'll now move to a panel. Because we started a little bit late, we'll go beyond 11:30, and whoever can stay will be great. So let me invite in Professor Steve Whitcomb from the Plymouth Marine Laboratory. He's a marine ecologist, so a good buddy of mine, but also an important figure in the research on ocean acidification, which we haven't mentioned today, but it's a big threat to many ecosystems and species. And I would like to also invite Professor Yaron Ziv. He's a terrestrial ecologist from the desert, coming from the desert, so this is kind of familiar to him. And we are missing Noga because she went to negotiate on important stuff. And Walid, maybe you can join in as well as on the panel, okay? As a stakeholder, I guess, right? Okay, because no, we don't want only scientists here, and we are missing Noga, so you all will fill in for her. So we had very different perspectives, I think, but dealing with the similar aspects of extreme events and how to deal with that and lack of data. And I'm curious to hear from you guys what is the one key message that you managed to get from all of these? If you see any commonality and how that might be relevant to stakeholder and policymakers. The next one will be about climate risk analysis, because you could hear Noga, they don't know how to do the climate risk analysis for environment. Maybe we can give some advice on how to do that. So, but let's start, Steve, maybe with.
Yeah, is this one? Yeah, this one's working. Okay, well, I thought the presentations were fantastic, and it's great to see the breadth of topics being covered, but also there were a number of things that really connected across for me. And the one thing I'd like to focus in on is the concept of the adaptation, the mitigation, and the nature-based solutions. From my own particular science world, there's a lot of talk at the moment about how we utilize nature to accelerate our attempts to try and address the climate problem. And to me, it fits into a number of issues. I mean, the first one I think we absolutely have to embrace is the concept of the precautionary principle in terms of what we do in terms of intervening in nature to be able to create a solution. I mean, as a species, we have a very poor record in using nature back to cure a nature-based problem that we've created ourselves. You know, we see that Australia is overrun with cane toads because we thought it was a great idea to cure a problem with another problem. But so I really urge the use of strong evidence-based, strong science-based decision-making before we launch into adaptation and mitigation strategies that that might end up giving us more problems than we started with. I also understand the urge that we absolutely have enough information around climate change impacts that we need to act quickly. Notwithstanding that, we don't need to panic, act, and make bad decisions. So as I look at natural-based solutions, there seems to be a few that are relatively easy wins, and it was lovely to see the ones that were very much focused on the restoration of natural systems by reducing the stresses that we're already placing on those systems. So we should be looking to remove those stressors and allow nature the space and the time to be able to recover in its own way to provide the goods and services that we need. Those seem to be the very easy first step things that we must be prioritizing. The second one is then about actually creating and manipulating interventions that promote nature to create a solution. And I think those need a lot more due diligence, risk-based approach with this precautionary principle. And of course there is some elements in the middle whereby we want to just removing the pressures on nature is not enough. We've damaged the system so much, we do need to give it a little bit of a helping hand. So that sits slightly in the middle. But I think my summary is nature-based solutions are so important to dealing with the climate issue. We need to be careful in how we do it and appreciate that not all nature-based solutions are the same. Some require a lot more due diligence than others.
Thank you, Steve. Johan, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here. And I would like Steve to join your remark about the fascinating talks that we heard. Really wonderful. And I would like actually, there are several messages or several points I would like to talk about, but we'll start with the first one. And given that we have 5 hours, we can talk more about later on. But basically, I think the first one I would like to talk about is, it has to do with what Professor Noga Kornfeld-Shore, our chief scientist of the Ministry of Environmental Protection, started in this session. And this is about her desire, wonderful desire, to have this biodiversity risk assessment and mapping. And it's great, it's wonderful, we all want it. At the same time, I'm afraid that when Noga comes to have this assessment, she will have a hard time. And she will have a hard time because she won't have the information that is needed. I mean, she will have this, we know Noga, she will end up with a nice risk assessment mapping, but there will be a lot of uncertainties. And the uncertainties comes from the fact that we don't have the knowledge, we don't have the information because we haven't collected this information for a long time, and currently we don't even have the framework in many countries all over the world, including Israel, to have the data for the long-term trajectory and understanding where we are going in terms of habitat destruction, climate change, and other risks that we're taking. And this, saying this means that we have to build the capacity. We have this capacity building that we need to work on in order to create a new, which is not new, it happens in some places in the world, to have the framework to collect the data and to have the proper properties and information to understand what is going on. We heard, again, wonderful talks here with amazing information, and we know from these scientists a lot about processes and a lot about scientific questions. In many cases, I mean, and there are great studies, this information is esoteric. I mean, if you ask some of the people here what your study tells us about where we are going, I mean, there was, Yael mentioned about that we don't have enough data to say something about the trajectory of the insect apocalypse and so on. We don't collect the data properly, we don't have the framework. We have, not only in Israel, all over the world, we have to come up with a new framework with very clear questions, very clear protocols to collect data for the policymakers, okay? We need the instruments, we need the devices, we need to have research stations that are distributed along the country and along countries, because maybe intergovernmental organization has to deal with that too. So we'll be able to tell our kids and grandkids where we are going and how we can prepare for the future in terms of long-term data. This means, and Marcelo said it very nicely, and Yael also emphasized it, and we got it from actually Gil's talk as well, that we need the resources, and we need something that has to do with governmental responsibility. Because only by having that data, we'll be able to say something for the future. And so this is the first kind of point that I would like to emphasize, and I hope that the government, the Ministry of Environmental Health, and other ministries will take it seriously. I mean, I hope this is one of the messages from this COP27. We're missing a lot of data. That's for now.
Thank you very much. I would join you to say that what's great presentations, and I learned a lot from all these results, and also the way how this research show new questions and the need of data and more scientific-based outcomes. As an economist and coming from social science, I would add another layer to all these results. First, it's important, before getting to the policy action, from the science evidence to the policy action, to understand how people would include all these new and important challenges upcoming for biodiversity. So, because policy action means that we have to incentivize or to restrict, command and control people to do things, but sometimes people will not do it. I have in mind one example. In France, in the planning system, land use system, they introduced a law showing that any new development should keep the existing trees, should not be cut, and this would be part of the private property. So in the plot of someone who built, but he or she does not have the right to cut it down. So that's fine. And at that time, I was a professor in a university in west of France, and I was supervising a PhD study on the social demand for environmental amenities, and the student has been working with those application of this work. What we observed through this research, that yes, in the beginning, all private owner respect the law. They say, okay, I'll have my garden, but I will keep the existing trees. That's what happened. But 80% of those trees was cut down right after 5 years. Why? The reason, it's a question of mindset. That's what I said. Because the fact, if the society cannot evolve to the fact that we have to live with the biodiversity, we are part of the ecosystem. We try to control the ecosystem, but by controlling the ecosystem, we kill it. And this is one major problem. I will finish with just a small story. Sunday, I was in another side event related to COP, but it's outside this building. It's one hotel in the downtown. And waiting for my presentation, I went around the hotel just to see. It was a very nice hotel. And then I saw on a wall, outside, in the wall, it was 3 p.m., 30 degrees, very hot. But on the wall, there was 4 big ventilators turning on. So I was surprised why they are putting air conditioning outside. One question. So I went to the manager. I'm a little bit curious though, so just I want to understand what's happening. I went to the manager. I say, look, you forget your ventilator, so there's a problem. You know, we are in a summit on climate. In Egypt, electricity very expensive, you know, etc. Guess what was the answer? Those not for air conditioning, those mainly to remove birds. We don't want to have birds on the wall because they pick the food of people, and we put the ventilator that birds cannot come. That's a shame.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay. You heard 5 different talks from 5 different ecosystems. My concern was that we actually met for the first time as a group to discuss similar aspects, and I think this is one thing that is missing still in the discussion among scientists themselves, because we share a lot of different problems. We can also share our minds to think about solutions. So I'm curious, what is, from your experience, Steve, about cross ecosystems collaboration of scientists, and also thinking about impacts, climate impacts, and what can we learn from that, and what were suggestions for both scientists collaboration and science needs for this kind of research and solutions across ecosystems?
I'll use this one. Okay, yeah. I will answer that. I just want to make one more point that I was going to make about, you presented really nicely about blue carbon, the concept of blue carbon, and we know about the value of carbon in trees and forests and what have you. The one thing I've heard spoken about in this conference a lot, which has slightly worried me, is this concept that we can use that carbon as a quick fix and as a reason for reducing our efforts around mitigation. We can fix it by putting our emissions into carbon ecosystems really quickly. What I would say to people, and the message I really want to give, is those carbon habitats, blue carbon, forests and what have you, are so important for maintaining biodiversity, so important for the long-term storage of carbon, but they are not a quick fix. I look at them as our pension. We are putting into our pension for the carbon we need to have stored in 100 or so years' time. They are not a replacement for mitigating our emissions right now and right here. So we must get away from that narrative that they are a quick fix. In terms of integration across systems, what we saw was that even though that the talks were in silos, there are huge interconnectivities between each of those systems, from changes in agricultural practice through to terrestrial systems, entering into our rivers and streams, and ultimately ending up in our estuaries and our seas. Often that kind of science is really difficult to fund. It's very difficult to get funding is often distributed amongst different research councils, and the fact they want to focus on the particular part of the system that they have a remit to do. In the UK, we do have a cross-council, a cross-centre funding opportunity, which I'm involved with, whereby we are obligated actually to present projects which are cross-systems. So I'm currently involved in a project called Ag Zero, Agricultural Zero, which is in collaboration with colleagues working in agricultural systems, in terrestrial systems, and in freshwater systems, and then into the marine system where I've been working, to look at the implications of behavioral change and agricultural change and climate impacts on terrestrial systems, and how that effects cascades down through the aquatic system and into the coast. So my call would be for more funding mechanisms and opportunities to allow scientists to have aggregated whole systems-based approach programs that address a particular problem from source to sink.
Thank you.
I totally agree with the approach, and that's something we need to learn in Israel, how to integrate different type of ecosystems. And a very important element that when we talk about policymakers is related to the non-market value of biodiversity. How we translate when in decision-making policy, when you're looking on blue carbon, you can quantify how much you can gain, and you can put a price on that. How much you can place a price on biodiversity and the importance on that. So it's a key limitation that we all face, and how we really can convince politicians and policymakers on the real value or the beyond the value of the market of biodiversity. And the integration of all the presentations we have here give us an indication that it's a huge element that should be considered going beyond that. And that's, I want to just add a few words on Yaron.
Yeah, thank you. I highly agree with Steve and with Marcelo with the two points here, and I think that there is no reason for me to repeat, because I'll probably say the same things, and the point is well taken. The points are well taken. I would like actually to touch something that has been said. Steve, you said, and you showed it with the nature-based solutions, and this is about restoration ecology. And just let us remember that the UN declared the current decade as the ecosystem restoration decade. And it is because we understand for many years now that many ecosystems, huge areas, actually, if this will remain by 2050, the new destructed areas on Earth will be the size of South America. It's amazing. The new data are really, really scary. And we have really to restore, rewind, reclaim. You know, there are many words for this, nature. And there was just recently, I was in a conservation, restoration ecology conference in Spain. And there are new studies by the UN, amazing ones, that show that for €1 invested in restoration, between 8 to 38 euros are gained for the human being in terms of the economy. So it's not only about the value or the non-value of nature, which I agree 100%. It is much more than that. It has social, economic, and ecological benefits. And it is amazing. We work on the restoration ecology project in the phosphate mines, in the Negev desert, huge areas. And only by bringing back the ecosystem to be part of the entire ecosystem, by the way, connecting between different ecosystems and between different habitats, only by doing that, we'll be able to restore and bring that back nature in order to bring back the balance between carbon emission and carbon and photosynthesis and getting better carbon. So I really want to emphasize here, and it touches pretty much all the different talks, that we have to move on very hardly with restoration. We need it because we need these open spaces.
Thank you very much. I want just to reflect very shortly on this question of the prices. There is a common confusion between price and value. Yeah, that's usually the economists want to talk about prices in monetary values, but in the reality, when it comes to environmental and natural assets, they may have sometimes a price, like land, for instance, but they have essentially a social value going beyond the price which is volatile, can increase, can decrease, depends on the market conditions. But please keep in mind, when we are talking about biodiversity overall as a system, ecosystem, please keep in mind we are not dealing with a private good. We are dealing with a common public good. And sometimes it's a global good. It's not only for the country or for the community or for private. So it's a question of the common goods. And coming back to Harden, one of very important philosopher in ecological economics, he was talking, his book is about the tragedy of commons. Yeah, talking about what happened in the UK when there is no owner for some lands, makes that everybody can have the maximum of profit of it. He don't care about. And this is what is happening in the biodiversity domain, because we know that this goes beyond the responsibility for states, governments, and think about the role of Amazon for all the planet. It's huge. So managing common goods needs first cooperation. In the OECD, we insist a lot of the needs for multilateralism to deal with climate biodiversity, that we think it's very important. Some African countries, Latin American countries, need today support to preserve their biodiversity. And here we urge in the update of post-HE target, we will see this in December, that we increase the commitment and the pledges from developed country to support actively and massively the protection of biodiversity. And this should go more than, because we pay a lot of attention to the climate finance, but biodiversity finance is something I hope in Montreal will be taken seriously. So common good, that's what I want to say here. And again, thank you very much. It was a great presentation, and I learned a lot, and I would be happy to continue the discussion later.
Well, just one comment about the value. I know that there are now tools to estimate the value of nature by using willingness to pay tools. So how much are you willing to pay, $10, to keep the marine ecosystem alive? So that's, I'm sure you're using these kind of tools, right?
Yeah, that's the contingent valuation based on the willingness to pay. It's a survey, so it's a stated preferences. So based on what you declare today maybe is different what you told me tomorrow. But there's more smart methods to estimate the values. We can talk about this later.
Just a comment today before we're concluding. Today there is another session about restoration and biodiversity, Ministry of Environmental Protection, and the Society for Protection of Nature in Israel. I apologize I can't be there because I need to meet 1,500 high school students on Zoom at that time, but I really recommend everyone to come because this is a really major issue, and thank you for those who are doing that.
I would like to thank you all for the excellent participation in the panel. The comments are very interesting and we learn a lot. And thank you for all the attending this session. I would like to conclude and wish you all luck on looking forward for good research, good policy making, and good luck for all. Thank you.